Hey guys, it is Wingy here and welcome to a brand new video. Or it isn't, in case you've seen this more than one time, but either way, welcome. So in today's video, I'm going to be looking at some underrated Doctor Who stories, and this is actually going to be the start of a brand new series. Every now and again, what I'm going to be doing is giving you guys some stories that I feel are underrated, and in other episodes, overrated. Because with a history as long as Doctor Who has had, you are bound to have some incredible stories and some crap stories. But within that, you're bound to have some stories that a lot of people don't necessarily like or talk about, even though they're actually quite good. And on the flip side of that, you have stories that everybody raves about and bangs on about when they're actually fairly average. So today I'm going to be talking about 4 stories that I personally think are really underrated. And I will do this in multiple parts as well, so if there's a story on this list that you think is underrated, then it will probably be on another episode of this. Likewise with the overrated ones when I get around to doing them as well. But anyway, let's get into this video. One of the most highly regarded eras of Doctor Who history is the 1970s, and I'm going to be talking about 2 stories today from the 1970s that I think are really underrated. First up, I'm going to be going with a story from Jon Pertwee's first season, and that's going to be The Ambassadors of Death. Now, this is a story that I think really divides people. Some people think like me and think it's really good, others think it's actually a load of crap. Do you mind? The Ambassadors of Death is a 7-part story, the 3rd story I believe from season 7. And yes, 7 parts does sound like a lot, but it's actually a rare occasion where it's a long story, but every episode needs to be there, and you're not bored throughout it either. That's only happened on a handful of occasions. Like obviously a lot of 60s Doctor Who and some of the 70s Doctor Who does feel like it drags on a lot. This story is most definitely not one of them. There's a lot of intrigue throughout this story, and you're sort of wondering throughout the entire thing, who is really the good guys? Who's really the bad guys? Whose side is that person on? There's a lot of double crossing, there's a lot of mystery. It's a very James Bond-esque style story, and obviously in the Pertwee era that's actually quite common. But there's just something about this story that whilst a lot of it you could say is quite generic for its time, it just screams quintessential Doctor Who, and it's so beautifully written and paced. It's kind of like a checklist for every great thing that's in the Pertwee era. Do you have Unit? Yeah. Alien invasion? Yeah. A organisation that isn't exactly what it seems to be? Yes. The companion getting kidnapped? Yes. Bit of espionage? Yes. The 3rd Doctor himself? Yeah. It's one of the early examples in Doctor Who history where they just use a simple spacesuit and they show how creepy that can be, something that they have gone on to use multiple different times throughout Doctor Who, even in the new series. If I have any gripes about this story, it's the fact that there is a lot of back and forth. People will get captured, then they'll escape, then they get captured again, then someone comes to rescue them, then they get captured, then they escape again. It does get a bit tedious after a bit. Another thing that really pisses me off is the conclusion to this story. Given how it's 7 parts and actually paced fairly well, the ending is very fast and anticlimactic. It's sort of the Doctor just going, right, well I've done my bit, you just clean up the rest. I think they could have handled it in a much better way. But I think this is underrated because when you think of the Pertwee era, you'll think of stories like Spearhead from Space, Terror of the Autons, The Time Warrior, The Sea Devils, all these other great stories. I feel like this one just slips under the radar, and it really shouldn't. If you're a fan of Pertwee's Doctor and you haven't seen The Ambassadors of Death yet, then most definitely go and check it out. Jumping forward a bit now, and I'm going to go to the Matt Smith era. Now again, this is an era of Doctor Who where you either love it or you hate it, or you don't really feel anything towards it. And whilst I do agree to a point that there isn't too many standout amazing stories in the Matt Smith era, there definitely are some hidden gems in there as well. I'm going to be talking about the Series 6 opener, which is The Impossible Astronaut / Day of the Moon, I think the full thing is called. See, I'm saying it's underrated yet I'm forgetting the title, that's quite bad. But no, this is actually a very good story. I almost forgot about this one, but I was kind of doing like a Doctor Who marathon recently and I came across this story and I watched it again. I mean, I remembered liking it when it was broadcast. But rewatching it again, I was reminded of actually how great this story is. There's something about this story that just makes Doctor Who feel like it's on such a big scale now. Some people like that, some people don't. I have to admit, I am one of those people where I do like Doctor Who to be a cheap, crappy looking sci-fi show. That is kind of the charm of it and the attraction to it for me. But at the same time, I can appreciate Doctor Who going to a different country and filming it on what looks to be an even grander scale and a bigger budget. There is a real cinematic quality to this story. Now, it does something that I just hate Moffat doing now, but this was realistically the first time where Moffat killed off the Doctor. I actually thought it was quite effective. I mean, by the time you get to the conclusion, it really wasn't satisfying in the slightest. But this is just the first part of that series. And as series openers go, it actually feels like a finale. I like the stuff with the US government as well. I just know the Doctor is exactly the type of person who would just go into the Oval Office and just stand there taking notes thinking, oh yeah, they're never gonna see me. I like how they incorporated the moon landing into this episode as well. I like the silence. I don't love them, but I really like them. That scene in the toilet in the White House where that thing is just stood there and that woman's just going, oh, what are you on about, darling? Or whatever she says. I apologise for my accent. And then she turns around, oh, is that a Halloween mask from Star Trek or something? I thought that was actually a really creepy scene, especially when that big bulbous-headed fuckwit just opened his mouth and all this lightning came out. That's probably the worst description ever of the silence. The thing with the little girl as well, especially right at the end where you see her regenerating, I remember at the time my jaw dropping. It was River, but you know, we'll get to that in a future episode. But as a standalone, this is really good. Canton I thought was a great character. I thought Matt Smith played it really well because obviously he is playing two Doctors in this story essentially. And I like how they mixed this in with a real life event. It just added to the story. I definitely say that this one is underrated because when people talk about the Matt Smith era, I don't really hear much from Series 6 as some of the best stuff, when I think this is personally one of Matt Smith's best stories. And plus for me, I think the reason why I like it so much is because it's just on the cusp of where Moffat just flat out lost control. Next up, we're going to head back to the 1970s with a Tom Baker story. Now, obviously, in the Tom Baker era, much like with the Pertwee era, there are so many great stories. So it is easy to forget some other stories, and that's why I'm going to talk about the Sontaran Experiment. I think a lot of people forget about this story, and I think you would. Not because the story's bad or anything, but when you look at the Tom Baker era, this is sandwiched in between the Ark in Space and Genesis of the Daleks, which are obviously known as some of Tom Baker's best stories. But the reason why this is on here is because as it is a follow-up essentially to the Time Warrior, it's never going to be as good as the Time Warrior. But my god, is it brutal. There's people being tortured, there's people dying in the most savage ways possible, there's betrayal, there's almost like an animalistic urge amongst themselves just to turn on each other. In terms of the space crew, not the Doctor, Sarah and Harry. And then you have Steyr, who just sounds like a German Gestapo man. But speaking of the Sontaran in this story, Steyr, I have to admit, controversially, and I know a lot of people are going to hate me for saying this, I actually prefer him to Lynx. Although Lynx smells better. Eh? Lynx, yeah? No. Okay. I think the reason for this is I prefer the lighter tones on his head. And I know that's such a ridiculous thing, but I always found that Lynx just looked too dark. He literally looked like a burnt potato. And you could say that Steyr looks like a raw potato, but I just prefer the design of his head as a whole. Sure, the mask doesn't fit as well as Lynx's did, but overall, I just prefer him. I saw the Sontaran Experiment long before I saw any other Sontaran story, so I do have a bit of nostalgia for him. Another reason that I think this story is very underrated is because if you're a new series fan and you haven't seen any classic Doctor Who whatsoever, I'd actually say go and watch this for your first one. Some of you might be wondering why, but the only reason I'm saying that is because it is a two-part story. Now, back in those days, one episode of Doctor Who was like 22 minutes long, something like that. So to put both parts together, it's about roughly 45 minutes, which is obviously the length of a standard episode of Doctor Who nowadays. So I feel in terms of watching it and the length of it, it's actually a good story to watch to kind of adjust yourself to the classic series format. I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys that it is the best Sontaran story, because it isn't. I do think that the Time Warrior as a story is a lot better. But what I will say is that this story is definitely a fun 2 episodes of Doctor Who that often gets overlooked. There are some ropey scenes where the Doctor and the Sontaran are fighting, and you can clearly tell that it is not Tom Baker. Now, the practical reasons for that was because on location, Tom Baker had an accident and he broke his collarbone, so he couldn't actually do any of the action scenes sequences. But if you can overlook that ropiness and the dodgy looking robot, then there's actually a lot here that you will find enjoyment from. The premise to this story is actually pretty cool as well. The Earth has been decimated by like solar flares or something, and Steyr's there just to test the humans, and then they're going to send in an invasion fleet as a new sort of command post in the galaxy. So whilst it has a small cast, it's actually very atmospheric as well. Like I say, it's not the greatest story of all time, but then again, it's definitely not the worst. So last but by no means least, we are going to be talking about a story that I have mentioned before on this channel, and we're going back to the Matt Smith era with Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone. Now, I actually put this story on my top 10 best stories of the new series. The reason why I think this story is underrated is purely because Blink exists. Everybody raves about Blink, and I may or may not be mentioning that in another video. I might not. I am. This story often gets overlooked when Time of Angels and Flesh and Stone is actually a much, much stronger story. I explain this in my top 10 list, but basically Blink is great for what it is, but it isn't really a Doctor Who story. This story feels like a Doctor Who story, and it actually adds more to the mythos of the Weeping Angels. Matt Smith looks so comfortable in the role of the Doctor, and this was actually the first stuff besides his regeneration scene that he filmed for the programme. You would not think that at all. Same goes for Karen Gillan. They both just fall into their roles perfectly. Now, this story isn't without its flaws. I do think that there are some things in this that I just can't believe. The angels are images. As creepy as that idea is, it still doesn't quite sit right with me. I think that's just a step too far for the Weeping Angels. But I do like the fact that they can kind of regenerate themselves and build up energy and just become strong again. And whilst part 2 does feel slightly distracted with the whole crack in the wall stuff, I actually think it's really effective. There's a lot in this story that really sets up the rest of Matt Smith's tenure of Doctor Who. And I think it is the last time that the Weeping Angels were actually intimidating, scary, or creepy, or any of the above. I just love it. I watched it recently and I loved it even more. But they're just some of my suggestions. But let me know what you guys think. Do you agree with my choices? Do you hate my choices? If you've seen them, just let me know what you think of the episodes on this list. Usually at this point I would say, what stories do you think are underrated? But I am going to be doing more parts to this and the overrated stuff as well, so I will in another video probably mention the stories that you would type in the comments. Or will I? I don't know. But either way, if you enjoyed this video, guys, then make sure you leave a like on it. If you want to see more Doctor Who related stuff on my channel, such as the Series 10 review, which is coming very soon, then make sure you subscribe, and if you do, I would love you forever. But until next time, guys, take care of yourselves. Goodbye. The ambassadors... How did it... Oh my god, this is going to be a long shoot.